Welcome to the Orange Couch Talks, a deeper dive from our leaders into our recent teachings.
Hey, Cross Church, welcome to the first Orange Couch Talks of 2021.
You still can't say it either.
Talks, yeah. It's a new year, same problems, right? And we're experiencing that in a lot of places. But anyways, moving on from that. This week, we just jumped into our new series, If Not Us, Who? And we're taking a look at the book of Esther. And it's very timely because Esther deals a lot with how God has called us to specific moments and specific challenges to use the gifting that He's given us and the opportunities that we have. And so Pastor Jackie and Pastor Andrew taught on that at their campuses this weekend, and I'm sure there was wonderful insights that can be shared.
There was a lot. What about you? We'll start with your insights.
Well, I could say I was at Surprise this weekend and heard Pastor Jackie walk through this great overview and how Esther really applies to us today. And I mean, it's easy to say Esther deals with challenges and how we need to use those challenges, but we're facing a lot of challenges, and you applied Esther as a book as a whole to some of those challenges today.
Yeah, maybe before we kind of exegete the text, maybe we should exegete our culture and just think about the world that we live in. And I think a lot of people had this fantasy that when we flipped the page of the calendar from 2020 to 2021, magically fairy dust would fall and the world would be different. And clearly that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're in the middle of a COVID winter that is more severe than what we've seen at any moment in 2020. We're living it right now in 2021. And I think along with that, and I feel your pain, those of you that are watching, because I think along with that there is some serious sort of COVID fatigue that is setting in that we're all dealing with. I'm dealing with it. Our viewers are dealing with it. People in our churches, those that we lead, are dealing with it. I talked with a school principal last week, and we just shared from kind of leader to leader, you know, the frustrations that she's having leading her school and that we're having leading our church. And so here we are in 2021, and the realistic projections that I'm hearing about just the COVID issue of our culture as we exegete our culture is that this is not going to end soon, even though there's a vaccine circulating. I think we're in for more of this, at least through the spring and possibly in the summer, who knows. Layered on top of that is the political divide and the inauguration and the threats of a new impeachment for the president, the breach of the White House last week. It seems like all year we've had problems stacked on on other things, whether it was racial tensions and all of that in the summer and the late spring. And so I'm sure your people here in Phoenix and Levine dealing with the same kind of fatigue, right?
Yeah. And I think the longer it goes on, we talked a lot as we were just waiting to get back to normal, but now it's almost, this is becoming a new normal and a new culture is setting in. So it's the culture of like, oh, we don't really go out, or we're not being able to go to church as much, or not going to school, whatever that looks like, is we're creating new habits because we're having to adapt to this. And I think for a lot of people, it's easy to create unhealthy habits, whether it's eating, whether it's self-medicating, whether it's in depression or addictions in some ways. And I think we're seeing that just on the rise, and we have to fight that battle so much that we don't fall into those traps.
Yeah, and the visceral of all of the political upheaval, and it wears on you as a person, as a leader.
Yeah.
It wears on good and godly people that have different opinions about stuff. I mean, I see preachers fighting among preachers on social media, like, you're on this side and you're a bad person. You took this position and you're a terrible person. And I've never seen it like this before in my lifetime. And as we kind of, flip the script and kind of go and think about how Esther applies to this, one of the things that we talked about at the Surprise campus this weekend is the sovereignty of God all over the story of Esther, that God providentially has placed Esther in an equally divided world as ours. The threat of annihilation under the rule of a despot as a king, the just all of the problems that they faced. And yet God in that place has this beautiful young woman by the name of Esther. God has gifted her with her beauty, and He's placed her there at just that exact moment in time to become the queen who will eventually save the day by asking the king for a favor. We talked about Acts 17, where it says God has determined our times and our boundaries. And God determined the time that Esther lived and the boundaries, the place, that her when and her where. He determined her time and her boundaries. And I don't know how much encouragement this gives you, but this is all the encouragement I have, all right? And that is that God knew everything was going to go on.
Yeah.
And He, for some reason, providentially chose us to live and lead through it. God didn't choose my grandparents or my great-grandparents who are in the grave. He chose me, and He chose you and us and you that are listening to live and lead in this moment, this unique moment in history. God chose my time and my boundary, meaning God chose my when and my where. And that gives me some encouragement. Like, congratulations, God thought we was worthy of this.
Yeah, it is a challenging thought. And me and my wife were talking last night about the fact that in this season it can feel so much like you've been forgotten, you're lonely, you're isolated. But the reality is, because God is sovereign, God is using you. He's placed you here to be used in this season. It's not that you're forgotten, it's that you've been chosen for a time like this.
Well, and I think one of the biggest encouragements we talked about, and I think I've seen through the book of Esther, is we sometimes just like to think of our world in a bubble and our history in a bubble. And I hear so many Christians are like, this is the worst we've ever had our country. This is the worst it's ever been. Like, things are just
Civil War?
Like, well, but that's what and sometimes I think we forget history, but we go to Esther. It starts off with the king having a 6-month drunken bender, and then invites the whole kingdom to a week after party of drinking, and literally
that was
making
called quarantine.
But it's like, we look at Esther in the setting, in the environment of that. It could have been easy for Esther and Mordecai to be like, this world is so jacked up, I'm not touching it. I'm going to just wait in the shadows. There's no way I can talk to a guy like Xerxes. He's a drunk, emotional addict. And it's like, there's no way we can reach this leader who's all powerful. Instead, they knew God was working in that situation, and it prompted them to act.
Yeah. And you think about God's sovereign. You look, just looking back on 2020, and one of the things we do this time of year is you look forward, you make your New Year's resolutions, or you set goals. But one of the things you typically do this time of year is look back on the past year. How did I do last year with my goals, my resolutions? How did my business do? How did my church do? How did the people I lead, how well did they do? And I was sharing this with our executive pastor the other day. In a strange way, as bad as 2020 seemed to be, I don't know if I'd take it back.
Yep.
There's so many lessons that God taught us through 2020. There's so many great things that the church did, Cross Church specifically did, through 2020 that just really lifted us to a new level. I mean, we have such a so much of a further reach with our messaging and with our ministry than we ever did before. We have a lady that we led to Christ from Rome, and through the technology that we now have in place, that we pivoted and put in place, she now watches with her mother in Italy our services every weekend and translates it into Italian. I mean, come on. Who would have thought that Cross Church, wherever it might be, in Phoenix or Levine or on the west side in Surprise, would have that kind of global reach? And yet we do, because of all the great lessons that God taught us in 2020. And sure, church is going to look different moving forward, and it's probably never going to look exactly the same, but it may never be as small and limited in scope and size as it was because of what happened in 2020. So when you think about hardships, God works all things together for the good of those that love Him and are called according to His name, right? And God has done exactly what He said He would do last year. 2021 hasn't started off any better this year. As a matter of fact, January 2020 wasn't too bad. And February wasn't bad either. I was in Myanmar in January of 2020. I was in New York City in February 2020. I was living life. And 2021's not started that great, but I can't wait to see how God uses it.
You said the statement, the sovereignty of God, quite a few times. Define that. What would you say? What is that word, sovereignty? I know it's not something we use in our everyday vocabulary, but what does that mean, the sovereignty of God?
Yeah, the best definition I've ever heard is this little phrase that God's sovereignty means that He always does what He pleases and is always pleased with what He does. There's no mistakes with God. God is intentional about working in the affairs of men. And I think in Esther, we're going to see played throughout here, is that it's a unique lesson on how human responsibility and God's sovereignty sort of collide. Esther's going to be asked to do some stuff. Mordecai did some stuff. But hovering over all of it is God's sovereignty. And so we're here today working under the sovereignty of God. We're doing some stuff, we're taping stuff, we're preaching stuff, we're trying to reach people with the gospel, and it's all of us, little mice running in this maze of life, and we're all doing our stuff, and we should, but over all of it is God's sovereign. God's in control. He always does what He pleases, and He's always pleased with what He does.
And I love that. And I think kind of some of the cool stuff that Esther shows us in that story is that God's always in control, God's always working, and God uses all the characters in Esther, but some of them are on the right side of His will and some of them are on the wrong. He uses Esther and Mordecai for great things to advance His will on the positive side, but He uses Haman and He uses Vashti in probably some bad ways, and even Xerxes of they're on the wrong side of it.
To say that God has a history of using kings we don't agree with to fulfill His divine plan.
Yep.
That actually happens.
Yeah,
now, that doesn't happen today, because if a president gets elected or not elected that we agree or don't agree with, then everything's messed up, right?
Exactly.
That's what happens to be.
For sure.
But God actually used Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament to judge God's people. He uses Xerxes to do the same, and then also to preserve God's people. He used Pharaoh until he said, I don't need Pharaoh anymore, and to give you a bath in the Red Sea or whatever. And
A bath.
so God, that's the thing I just wish our people could get their heads around, because I feel their pain. I know the angst and the agony, and even some of them the anger that they feel based upon all the geopolitical stuff that's going on in our world. But God actually even uses bad kings as well as good kings to do His will.
Yeah.
Well, and I think Esther, as we'll get to, shows the fantastic response in particularly challenging times. That not only did Esther be obedient to God's call, but she rallied God's people behind her to spend time in prayer and fasting to focus themselves on God's will. And so we had that kind of same response this last week with some of the craziness happening in the Capitol and everything. Pastor Jackie, you called our church together for an evening of prayer and challenged us to fast. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we had a great turnout, by the way, just like last minute, let's meet at the church and pray. And a great turnout of people in person, and then those that watched via Zoom. And it was just a great time and a great evening of sort of setting our hearts. I mean, prayer is not us changing God's mind. It's God's changing our minds and our thoughts about stuff. And so out of that, we've even said that during this series, I know this drops on Thursday, this Orange Couch Talk, but so the day before, we spent a day praying and fasting on Wednesday. And every day on Wednesday during this series, we're just challenging you to set aside a time to pray and fast. Hey, if you're really that concerned about our country, now I don't want to get too preachy here, but if you're really that concerned about our country, I would suggest to you, boycott whoever you want to boycott, or message whoever you want to message with whatever link you want to share. But if you're really concerned about our country, I think setting aside a day of praying and fasting for our country
Yeah.
might be better and more effective.
Absolutely. And you see fasting multiple times throughout the Bible. It's this time of intense focus on prayer, right? You generally give up something that makes you feel a need to fill something in that, right? And so you give up food. When I get hungry, I know I got to pray a little bit more, right?
I gave up parlor. No, too soon. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness. And
It's a rabbit hole we're not going down.
But I mean, like, fasting is something that should be done for big moments, for big things. I mean, it was something me and Cody did whenever we were pregnant. You know, we wanted to.
You were pregnant. Now, this is the deal. You guys all lean in and listen up. This is the old sage trying to correct these young
I think
millennials.
I agree with you on this.
I just never understand it when couples say we were pregnant. And then,
I've never been pregnant personally.
Well,
My wife has.
I just wonder, were you pregnant in the delivery room? Did you deliver?
No, my wife has actually numerous times reminded me that I was not pregnant and did not give birth to the
Okay,
baby.
I'm sorry to distract
So
you.
we were fasting as the point of that statement. And we took time
After she
as
was pregnant?
Cody
'Cause they
was
gotta eat a
pregnant.
lot of food.
I'm going to remember this when you guys share something in just a moment. I'm going to nitpick every sentence. But we wanted to fast because not only was it a huge new change for us to be parents, but we wanted to fast and pray over the future of our child and how she would be influencing the kingdom and how we were going to raise her to be somebody that is dynamic for God and his people. And so that we fasted for that. And I feel like that might be a more natural thing to want to fast for. It's like, oh my gosh, we're about to have a kid.
Yeah.
But things like this in our world, things that happen in our church, things that happen in our families, things that happen in our workplace. I mean, a lot of times we think, I need to have conversations or do something to make it happen. But more often than not, I think the answer should be prayer and fasting.
Yeah, the Bible says some things come out only by prayer and fasting.
Yeah.
Lindley came out only by prayer and fasting.
That's for sure.
But the issues of our country, seriously, are so grave and so important. The needs in our churches, the needs in our city, the lostness of our city. Lost in all of this is the real tragedy in our city is not COVID or politics, but it's the lostness of our city. And the lostness of people that teeter on the brink of an eternity separated from God is really worth, let's get on our knees, let's pray, let's ask God to do something big.
Well, and I love that. I think chapter 4, where we get this from, where Mordecai, he's the first one to put on sackcloth and ash. He fasts. He leads the Jewish people in doing it. But I love the last section, last verse of chapter 3 says the city of Susa was in confusion. And he saw that the city of Susa was in confusion. It was chaotic. It was crazy. Jews were literally going to die. How did he get clarity? He fasted and prayed to God.
Yeah. Well, that's probably no greater description of our world right now. Our whole world, not just a city, is in confusion.
Yep.
And so it really does call for prayer and fasting. I hope you guys will join us in that and be encouraged also, because you said there's the good side and the bad side earlier, that we're at work. And the interesting thing is that in the good side, there was bad in the good side.
Yeah.
These were imperfect people. Esther's not a perfect person. We'll see that this coming weekend, chapter 2. You don't want to miss it. If you're a Bachelor fan, you want to be here for...
Go to Surprise for that, because I'm not talking about that in meetings.
It's the fantasy suites coming our way in chapter 2.
Literally don't even know what you're talking about anymore. What is the
If
fantasy
you went to
suite?
Surprise.
Yeah,
Oh.
way to play it
And
off,
watch
right?
The Bachelor. You got to have the two.
Yeah,
so.
I don't watch it. I told our people, my wife watches it. I'm praying and fasting for her. But I overhear it sometimes when I'm watching religious programming.
Wife watch.
Religious programming.
Yeah.
What's religious programming?
Copeland and the guys.
Oh my goodness.
But anyways, what was I talking about? Oh, they're imperfect people, just like us.
There you go. On that note.
Do ordinary things, and very ordinary. No Red Sea is parted in the book of Esther. God's name's not even mentioned in the book of Esther.
Yeah.
They don't call fire down from heaven like Elijah. They just do ordinary things. They just tell people about a request. We're asking you to do ordinary things at our church most often. Invite somebody to church. Tell somebody about Christ on your street. Be generous with your resources. share a Facebook link of our video. Just ordinary stuff that can have extraordinary impacts in people's lives. So we're glad you tuned in. We hope that maybe some of this has made sense as we've, listen, I think it is healthy to laugh right now. If you're not laughing, then I'm praying for you, because
Probably crying instead.
well, we're laughing instead of crying in place of it. But I think we do need to keep a good sense of humor, because I do really believe that if we believe in the sovereignty of God, that gives us permission just to trust in Him. And I hope that you'll do that this week.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and don't forget to go out and make Jesus known.